Welcome back to the Metal Exchange. Justin and Chris taking it way back in time as we go to 1998, which I can't believe has been 25 years. We'll get there. Chris, my friend, it's been a while. How are you doing?
I'm good. Back from another trip. It's good to be back, and I think we can probably get to back into a rhythm again finally after all these interruptions and things that have been going on. So, yeah.
I have to say, while you were gone, I had a chance to catch up on a lot of things, and I want to mention a couple of things that really caught my ear. For the first time in what felt like forever, we got new music from Scar Symmetry. They came out with a single called Scorched Quadrant. If you like Scar Symmetry, you're going to like this. It comes off their new album called The Singularity Phase 2 Xenotaph. It comes out on June 9th, and this single was really, really good. If you like their brand of melodic death metal, you will thoroughly enjoy this, and I'm very much looking forward to the album. I thought their last album was amongst the best material in their entire discography, and this seems like it's right in that same vein. The guitars were a little chunkier than I would have liked, but the keyboards, more than made up for that thick guitar tone that they had. Did you have a chance to hear it?
Not yet, but I did buy the single. This is probably going to be like my first real full Scar Symmetry deep dive. Unless did we do one of their albums?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think we might be due.
So I don't know that I've ever actually really dug into any of their albums. So this I'm making a point when this comes out to really give it a good listen. But I will check it out. I kept an eye on stuff while I was away, and I just found myself jumping onto iTunes and just buying singles because it was like every time I looked, like somebody else was dropping a new single. Night Flight and Bloodbound and Art Nation. Like, I'm not going to go into specifics because I haven't actually had a chance to listen to anything, but just a lot of stuff. I'm going to get to it eventually, but I'm definitely behind right now. But Scar Symmetry is on the list with many others.
You mentioned one in particular that I did check out, which was the Art Nation single. That song was awesome. I cannot impress upon everyone enough. Check this out. It was the same sound that they've had for the last few albums, but it had a little more, like, I don't want to say balls, but like it was a heavier release, and it reminded me of like if you kind of dialed up their sound and just kind of made it a little bit heavier. It really hit the spot for me. It was one of my favorite songs that I've heard this year, and if the album is any indication, they've gone in this heavier direction, and I'm definitely a fan. I'm gonna keep an eye out for that album when it comes out. And two other albums that I had a chance to listen to actually yesterday and today. The new Crownlands album, Fearless. If you are a fan of Rush, you have to run and check this album out. I am not typically a fan of when a band does what can otherwise be described as just a tribute to another band, but they do it so well that it's worth checking out. They basically put a modern spin on 2112 era Rush, which is like the biggest compliment I can give them. It's an album that I only listened to once so far, but I will definitely be going back to. If you're into that prog rock, check them out. And the other one I wanted to mention was the new Powerwolf. I listened to that today, and I got to be honest with you. I've told you my thoughts on the band, but their live show completely changed my perception of them, and I enjoyed that listen as well. It was, I don't know if it's something I'm going to go back to 1,000 times, but it was a very enjoyable listen for the one time I've played it so far.
Yeah, so all things that I have on my list of things to check out, including the new Ad Infinitum album that came out last week. That is also high on my list. I did get a chance to check out the new Floor album, Floor Jansen's solo album, and the new Baby Metal album, and I enjoyed both of those. I'll definitely be going back to those two, but I still want to listen to Demons Down and Nay Obliviscaris' new album, and I have a few things, but I don't think it's anything that I'm gonna end up drowning over. It's been a good year so far. I have to say, we're into April, and there's been a lot of really good releases. So
Yeah, I agree.
I think the list is going to be way more dense, as that word tends to pop up with us when we get to the end of the year.
And I feel like you're going to start cutting stuff at that point to kind of like cut it down to 50 or whatever, because I can already see it's going to be kind of bloated, because stuff on the back end is just more enjoyable, in my opinion, than it was last year. You know, stuff that I anticipate putting at 42 or 50 or whatever. It's going to be good. I'll tell you one little story. I don't think I had a chance to tell you even offline. I went to see Queensryche on Saturday night, and they put on a phenomenal show. They were very loud, but the set itself was really good. They were so tight, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. They're actually playing in New York City tonight as well, but I got to see the Long Island show. But I'll tell you a funny story. Marty Friedman was one of the openers, obviously, of Megadeth fame, and he was doing a set of instrumental material with his band, the Marty Friedman Band, and really interesting stuff. I had never heard his solo material, but he's such a good guitar player that it had a very like Japanese influence, because I think he's living in Japan now. His whole band is from Japan. So really interesting music. And he's playing his set, and about halfway through the set, he ends his song and he starts playing about 2 or 3 minutes of Tornado of Souls. And I obviously started marking out, because I've never heard him play this material. So even though it was only 2 minutes, I was in absolute heaven. And the song ends, and the crowd's kind of going crazy, because obviously I don't know that everyone was familiar with his solo stuff, but I don't know that there were many people in that room that did not know Tornado of Souls. So he gets a big rousing ovation after that track. And the guy behind me says, and I will never forget it, he goes, actually, I'll tell you exactly what it was. He says, and I quote, he says, "Play some Megadeth, dude." But he wasn't kidding. I think that he didn't realize that he actually just played like 2 minutes of a Megadeth song. And I'm like, this guy wouldn't know Megadeth if it slapped him in the face. And I was going to turn around and look at him, but I didn't get a good look. But the whole thing, it was like a cringeworthy moment, because he literally played the only 2 minutes of Megadeth in his entire 45-minute set. And he's complaining that he didn't play any Megadeth. I don't know. The story, maybe had to be there. I thought it was funny.
It's funny you mentioned that song, because I heard it on the radio yesterday.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah. As soon as I got in the car to head over to my parents' house for dinner, I had, I think Ozzy's Boneyard just happened to be on, and that was the song that was playing when I got in the car.
Just as good as we covered it a couple of years ago. That album never gets old.
Yeah. Maybe that guy should have listened to it.
Seriously. But that being said, we are doing one of your albums this week, and it's an album that I knew we would get to. I just wasn't quite sure when. It's our second foray into an Edguy album, except this time we go back to January 15th, 1998, and we do Edguy's Vainglory Opera. A real classic for us, I think, because this was in our formative years of European power metal back 25 years ago. What I'm curious to know is, what were your thoughts, just broadly speaking, on this album, nostalgia aside, as you listen to it again? I would have to think for one of the first times in a while.
It's, I always thought this was a better album than Theater of Salvation, but I don't know that I feel that way anymore, actually, now that I've gone back and listened to it. And we did Theater of Salvation not too long ago, although it may have been almost 2 years ago now that I think about it. But I think that this album there's some songs on this album that are better than any of the songs on Theater of Salvation, but I think Theater of Salvation on the whole might be a better album start to finish. And I'll get into specific reasons why as we go track by track, but there's definitely a lot of good nostalgia feels here, and it's I still think it's a really good album. I just don't know. I don't know that I would call it like the definitive Edguy album anymore. It certainly is their breakout album, though. I don't think that can be denied.
Yeah, it's really their third, or maybe I guess some would say their second official studio album. I never thought it was as good as Theater of Salvation, not just because the production isn't as good, but I always thought it was a little off, like unbalanced is the word I would use. In other words, there's certain tracks on this album that are phenomenal and they stand the test of time, and they're some of the most classic late 90s power metal album, power metal songs. And then there's other ones that kind of lost me back in the day. And I gotta be honest, having gone back to it, I didn't love the album as much as I used to. And I used to like it a lot, although I thought it was second to Theater. I didn't love it as much this time, and I was listening to it even with the nostalgic lens, but something was missing on some of these tracks for me, and I'll get to those, but it's interesting because I was looking back, and like I think of bands like obviously Halloween, which we talk about a lot, but even Angra and Stratovarius, and I think I gravitate towards those bands a little more than Edguy, even though I would probably consider myself an absolute Avantasia freak when it came to those first few Avantasia albums.
Yeah, all fair comments. I just think I think maybe because at the time I literally owned this and Theater of Salvation. Like those were my two Edguy albums, and then Mandrake would come out, followed by Hellfire Club, which Hellfire Club I think is in my argument for Edguy's best album, start to finish. I think Mandrake also has a lot of really, really strong songs. So to me, like those four albums, along with Theater of Salvation, were to me the real heyday of Edguy before they started to maybe get a little bit too goofy and a little bit too like they kind of steered away from the classic power metal sound that they had. They were really one of the pioneers of the late, like the mid to late 90s power metal that followed, the Halloween and Gamma Ray, Blind Guardian, the forefathers, if you will. Edguy was kind of like that top of that second wave of power metal bands. So you could see a lot of the brilliance is starting to come through here. There's some good tracks on Kingdom of Madness, which preceded this, and they would go on and re-record the Savage Poetry, which the re-recorded version is outstanding. The songwriting, you could tell even at a really young age, the songwriting was there. It's just, if you've ever listened to that original album, it's I don't know if the band considers it a demo, but it's pretty rough sounding.
It's rough, yeah.
But when they re-recorded it, it's actually one of my favorite Edguy albums, the re-recorded version of it. I almost forgot to mention it in mentioning those other four albums. I believe that came out in between Theater and Mandrake. But anyway, yeah, there was some good stuff on Kingdom of Madness, which was, I think, their first like full-length album. But yeah, this to me was really the breakout, I think, where people really were started to pay attention to the band. For whatever reason, though, I ended up getting Theater of Salvation first, and then backtracking. I think it was Pat who had said, like, "Oh, if you like Theater of Salvation, you got to hear Vainglory Opera." And being that there wasn't really much else to go on at that point, being that Savage Poetry hadn't even been re-recorded yet, it was the natural next album for me. And I remember really liking it. I remember, and I probably mentioned this on the Theater of Salvation episode, is that I had such a hard time picking songs from that album to put on mixtapes, because I didn't think anything stuck out, because the album was so solid start to finish. And my favorite song would end up being the 13-minute title track, and I wasn't about to put that on a mixtape due to its length. So I don't think I ever ended up using any songs from that album on a mixtape, whereas this album had songs that really stuck out. I believe I used Out of Control and Until We Rise Again on some earlier playlists without looking. Definitely, I went Scarlet Rose, of course, because God knows I needed to put a power ballad on every mixtape. But then there, going back on it, there's, especially towards the end of the album, I feel like the album kind of drifts off in a kind of lackluster kind of way. Although if you I have some things to say about the bonus track, but I'm rambling. Why don't you say things now?
Well, I'm gonna be honest with you. Um, I look back on this, and there were a couple of things that I just did not realize at all about this album. Number one, we obviously Dirk Sauer and Jens Ludwig are on guitars. That is an Edguy staple. But what I didn't realize is that Toby not only does the vocals and the keyboards, but he plays bass on this album. Had no idea. And they had to basically bring in a guy by the name of Frank Lindenthal to do the drums. Apparently he was like a friend of the band, and he's just like lays down these drum tracks. I had no idea. And so really it's a 3-piece band with a hired gun as a drummer, but yet they're able to bring on two guest musicians, one that does vocals on 2 tracks and another that does a guitar solo on one of the tracks. But like arguably the two biggest names, or two of the biggest names in power metal in 1998, and that's Hansi Kirsch and Timo Tolkki, respectively. I thought that was absolutely fascinating that, like, here's this little German band, but they're able to get these guest spots at a time when guest spots were not as common as they are now.
Yeah, and I think that having Hansi on there, especially, I think really lent credibility to this band that not a lot of people probably knew at that time. One of the things that I think is absolutely fascinating about this band is, like, we constantly talk about the whole revolving door and incestuous band members in metal and stuff. This is a band who, other than Dominic Storch, who was their drummer up until right before this album came out, there aren't any other former members of Edguy except for drummer Dominic Storch that were like full-time, like recognized members of the band. Toby Exel and Felix Bonk, or Bonke, both joined the band in time for Theater of Salvation, and the band's lineup was the same all the way up until now, whether or not you consider the band, in existence still or not. I don't think that they haven't officially like announced that they've retired or anything, but much like Gamma Ray, for all intents and purposes, the band's pretty much on hold right now, in favor of the larger moneymaker, much like Kai and Halloween, Toby and Avantasia. Although Felix, I believe, is also drumming for Avantasia as well. But yeah, this has been a very consistent lineup, and it hasn't completely formed at this point, as you said.
Even though he's not on the album, I'll give you a little trivia question. You have any idea what Felix Bonk is up to now?
I think he's at home playing Bonk's Adventure on his TurboGrafx 16.
He might be, except he's actually the drummer for a band, well, I should say the former singer of a band that I mentioned earlier. He's Jeff Tate's drummer. So I remember, I saw Jeff Tate in concert maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, and he was the drummer for Jeff Tate. I think he might have been the only person in the crowd that knew his former life, but it was, needless to say, he did a very good job playing Operation Mindcrime in its entirety.
I have to wonder if that came about after Jeff Tate toured with Avantasia and saw him play live, or
you might be right.
Or before that. I mean, who would have ever guessed that Kiko Loureiro from Angra would be the guitarist for Megadeth? And isn't Megadeth's drummer the guy from this used to be in Soilwork?
Yes, that is correct.
So some of these like European guys are really getting. We talked about Michel Lupi being with what band was he playing with?
Whitesnake.
Whitesnake, like it's wild. So good for these guys. There's so much talent, and it's cool seeing them get some bigger gigs, I guess, especially considering that, like I mentioned before, like Edguy's not really doing very much. So it's nice to see the rest of the guys keeping busy. We talked to Jens a couple of years ago about his project at the time, so it's cool. It's cool seeing that they're. I have a feeling though that Vakken's going to come calling one of these days, and there'll be a reunion show, and I just don't see I don't see Edguy as playing their. Maybe they might not record anymore, but I don't see them as played their last show.
No, in fact, Halloween was just announced as one of the headliners for Wacken, so I can only imagine Edguy getting a similar shot at it at some point, especially because Avantasia's done it. So if Avantasia has done it and Halloween's doing it, at some point I could imagine Edguy getting the call saying, go play a set of your classic material. But I digress. Let's talk about some Vainglory Opera. This album starts off with a 1.5-minute intro that can only be described. I mean, I'm laughing because I'll say it this way. Chris, what comes to mind when you hear Overture by Vainglory Opera?
The Keeper.
Yeah. Which to most people means
nothing. To most people it doesn't mean a damn thing, but to us and a very small other number of people, this reminds us of Couch Potatoes.
What's Couch Potatoes, Chris?
Maybe we need to post it. Maybe if you sign up for the highest level of Patreon, we'll share the video for you. But
I don't think the prices are high enough.
Yeah, it's a video that Justin and our friend Nick made when they were in high school, and the whole idea of it was that these two guys would be watching TV and they would change the channel, and we would act out what they were watching on each channel. And one of the things we chose was it's a wrestling channel. And one of the characters to come out was called the Keeper, and he had this big silver hooded robe thing on, and it just was kind of reminds you of that Keeper guy from the Keeper of the Seven Keys album covers. It was played by our good friend Mike, and he came out to this song in very dramatic fashion, and then proceeded to unhood himself to showing the face of the man underneath. And so yeah, this song is forever ruined because of that. But it makes me laugh.
It makes me laugh. I can't listen to it. I mean, other than the nostalgia feel, it's absolutely it's got the nostalgia feel, if nothing else. The orchestration is there, the chants are there. I mean, it's all on display. But then we get into the opening track, Until We Rise Again, and you can immediately see how their songwriting has improved for this band. When you compare it to some of their prior stuff, this, in my opinion, is the song that really kind of launches the classic Edguy era. Better production on this for sure. Ironically, not perfect, but I didn't realize that Timo Tolkki was helped with the mixing of this, which I had no idea. Very, very interesting. And the choruses, what's interesting is they feel that they have these layered vocals, which I don't know that I ever realized or picked up on when I was younger, but there's almost layers to the vocals. This is your quintessential opening track to a power metal album, and the song holds up great. And what's interesting is you have a young Tobias Sammet on vocals, and you can hear how young he sounds on this, but it's charming nonetheless. It's a great power metal tune.
Yeah, this one really knocked my socks off the first time I heard it. I was like, wow, this is pretty killer. Your classic Halloween inspired, classical style intro, and then right into this blistering power metal tune. This still holds up for me. I think it always will. It's just a really, really good tune. And if anyone's ever had a chance of listening to Kingdom of Madness, you would really appreciate the improvement in the sound or the overall production here, which I think jumped even further with Theater of Salvation. I think they really found their sound in a lot of different ways, but production wise as well. This is a little bit rougher than Theater, but still a pretty solid production for the time, and for a fairly newer band that I assume was probably working with a limited budget. I don't think that it's anything that kind of is bothersome to listen to, as some older material can be at times.
We've listened to albums that sound a lot worse.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, recently, I'm looking at you, Thor, Thorson, Thor Thorson and the Thorsons. This I enjoy this song a lot. Picking a song of the week was hard for me. I think I'm just gonna pick the song that I like the most and not be not try to be fancy about it. But this is definitely probably in the top 3 or 4 on this album for me. I like this song quite a bit. And it really, I think it shows off the, much like Eagle Fly Free, where you're getting a little bit of everything towards the end. You get to hear the bass and the drums and the guitars and everything. This kind of does that same sort of thing, but in a more Edguy, trademark sort of way. Like, this is them kind of really showing what kind of band that they were going to be going forward.
Yeah, and it's obviously upbeat and fast, and then it kind of slows down just a touch with How Many Miles, which is more of like an anthemic tune. It's kind of there's a pacing to this song which is really, really interesting. I want to share my thoughts, but why don't you talk to us about How Many Miles and your thoughts on this, because I have some strong opinions on this one.
Yeah, this is a song that I think I probably didn't appreciate as much as I should have back in the day, because it's got the keyboards at the beginning remind me so much of Power Quest. I know I bring up Power Quest a lot, but I think that they're...
Well, it was weird because when we started talking about Emperor offline, you started talking about Power Quest, and I said, just because there's keyboards doesn't mean they sound anything alike.
They sound exactly the same. But like, to me, like Steve Williams was always the master of these really great keyboard chords, and this song has, I don't think of Edguy as a very keyboardy kind of band, but when I go back and listen to this song, like, it's very the keyboards really drive the whole tune forward, and it's for a more mid-tempo kind of song. I mean, the chorus is pretty fast, but the rest of the song is pretty much like a mid-tempo song. It's super catchy. It's really memorable, and I like this one a lot. It's up there for me on this album as far as great songs. I think that we'll talk about the album on a whole, but I feel like the album is a little bit top heavy. And I think this song kind of helps pull the weight towards the top.
You kind of hit the nail on the head with the first thing you said, and that's, you never really appreciated this song, I guess, back in the day. I gotta be honest, going back to an album which I thought I knew very well, I just kind of forgot about this track. I loved it. I thought that this song was phenomenal. I thought the verses were really good, and how it just picks up steam during the choruses. It was almost like proggy because of the way that the pacing kind of changes throughout. It never gets blazing fast, but there's these like changes of pace between the verses and the chorus. I thought it was awesome. This is a wildly, wildly underrated tune, and a song that I think if I was going to make an ideal set list, I'd probably at this point put it in a live set list. I'm going to make it my song of the week because it was the song that put the smile on my face more than any other, and it's probably because I haven't played it as much as some of the others. So let's give it a listen, and we'll talk a little bit more about How Many Miles. As I was listening to the track this week, for some reason, it kept reminding me of something, but I couldn't put my finger on it, and I hate when that happens. But the song itself just reminded me of something else, but it never came to me.
The beginning of it reminds me of something that I would be shocked if you shared the same sentiment, but it reminds me of a part of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the original movie soundtrack. The keyboard part. I would have to like literally find the song and like post the part of the song that it reminds me of. But that's just my warped comic, or not comic book, but just my warped pop culture brain crossing the wires, if you will. But that's the song. Yes. If anybody out there, if How Many Miles makes you think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 1990 film soundtrack, please reach out to me, and I'll let you know. The address of my padded room.
No, that didn't occur to me, but there was something there for sure. We move on to Scarlet Rose, which you mentioned earlier. One of a few ballads on this album, which is not terribly long, so I find that interesting. It starts with this beautiful acoustic guitar intro with Toby's vocals on top. And the verses are actually better than I remember. And the chorus, rather depressing. It definitely sets the mood. I don't know what mood it is, but it definitely sets the tone. One criticism I have, and this is a very good song, but there's these layered vocals during the choruses. I just didn't think they were necessary. I thought that this was an example of where less would have been more. And if they would have just had Toby sing this straight, I think it would have probably done a little bit better for me. But nonetheless, about halfway through the song, the full band comes in, and I don't know, there's something about it where, like, other than the guitars, which are just phenomenal throughout the entire thing, it's the best ballad on the album for my money, but there's just elements of it that I don't love, which makes it not a perfect song.
Okay. I still really like it. I always liked it when I was younger, when I was like really ballad obsessed. But there's some really good like Spanish guitar work, and I just think like every friggin' power metal band was making a song like this around this time. But I think this is on the higher end quality wise, especially because I didn't think Theater of Salvation had a real a really great ballad on it.
They ran out after this album because they had so many.
Yeah, I mean, and Edguy does a pretty good job writing these, like, I don't know if you want to call it a love song or a breakup song or whatever, but I always like this song. I still do. It's I had mentioned in the past, and I think I actually posted the playlist that I made long time ago of kind of bedtime metal songs, stuff to listen to, and this was on it. It's kind of like a power ballad / chill metal mix, and I really like it. It's odd to me that it's so early on the album, because usually like the big home run ballad is usually closer to the end of the album. But I guess, as you mentioned, there are at least two other ballad type songs, so I guess you kind of had to space them out.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why they did it, and they could have put this one further back, but that would have just meant pushing one of the other ones up that may not be as good overall. So I think that's why it was up front. But then it ends, and then we get into arguably my favorite track on the album, and that's Out of Control. The beginning of this song sounds like Sunday Mass for all the Catholics out there, right? With the organs, like it really, it reminds you of church, but then all of a sudden the band kicks in and you get this slow, epic tune that has this big feel with a big, especially at the time, guest vocal performance by Hansi Kirsch, which, whether that was done as a favor to Toby or what have you, it's phenomenal. And the way they use his vocals in this track is nothing short of phenomenal. Just a great, simple riff throughout, a song that you want to bang your head to. And just, one of the most iconic choruses on the entire album. What are your thoughts? And I have to think it's one of your favorites.
I'm trying to remember if this was the first time I ever heard Hansi, or if it was on the Gamma Ray's Land of the Free album, which we've talked about previously. But I know that I had heard him on both of the albums before I had purchased my first Blind Guardian album, which incidentally was Nightfall and Middle Earth, which we also discussed not that long ago. That being said, yeah, this was always a standout song, even from the beginning, and I think that it still is, again, probably in my top 3 or 4 songs on the album. I think that the Hansi parts are really well placed, and they really add a cool layer to an otherwise really, really strong song. I think that this and then the following track, the title track, these two are really heavy hitter songs right in the pretty much the dead center part of the album. And I was saying while we were taking a break for the last song, this album may have been better suited for with a different order, just because I feel like these first 6 tracks, I think at least 4, even if you want to count Scarlet Rose, like you have like really heavy hitting tracks, and then it kind of moves on to, I think Fairy Tale and Walk On Fighting are good songs, but then after that it kind of I don't know. I'll talk about it when we get to it. I don't want to give away too much up front, but yeah, this and Vainglory Opera together are a pretty big 1-2 punch of real just heavy power metal classics.
And Vainglory Opera is like the big epic on the album in that it comes in at over 6 minutes. What's really notable here is that the keyboard intro, and they kind of mimic this during the solo, later on in the song, it has a real feel of Galaxies by Stradivarius. Like, you almost wonder if Timo Tolkki was helping them in the studio when he was doing the mix. He's like, you got to add this here. But it was literally just ripping off a song that he had, essentially wrote a couple of years prior. I hear that loud and clear, and it makes me think of Fourth Dimension every time I hear it. But this song has this like slow gallop to it, which I think that it almost makes the listener kind of wait for the big payoff. And it definitely comes in what I would say is like this big cheesy chorus, but it's like really, it's what you'd expect for power metal. I think it's a very, very good song. And I think that having Hansi on the bridge is just an amazing touch. Not quite as powerful as Out of Control, but just a really nice touch. This is the song, I think, more than any other, which makes me think of what Avantasia would ultimately become, because I think this was like a preview of what Avantasia would ultimately be.
Yes. That is my that is what I'm going to contribute here. I completely agree with that sentiment. I love the Galaxies rip. It really does sound like the same like keyboard track that they used, or whatever you want to call it. It's funny. I never really put 2 and 2 together. Like, I realized Timo Tolkki was involved. Now that I think about it, yeah, maybe he did have a little something to say. But this has just all the elements of Edguy that I really like, and it's like you said, it does have that kind of gallop to it, especially at the beginning. It's not one of the fastest songs on the album, but I think it's the best song on the album, and for that reason, it is my song of the week, the title track, Vainglory Opera, and we'll give it a quick listen, and then we'll come back and talk about Edguy some more.
May they join my way to bring me a victory. Severing that one strong. My triumph and my pride, I will be history. But behind my enemy's eyes, something in disguise. Not only lies. We live to fight the hand of doom. We got the right to strike a fool. May glory be my wicked guide. We live to fight the hand of doom. We got the right to strike a fool. May glory be my wicked guide.
Well, excellent choice. I'm not terribly surprised that you picked this. I thought you were going to choose this or Out of Control, so I had a 1 out of 2 shot, and I guess I was right. Very good.
Just to pull it up to something kind of recent and modern. Like, this sounds like it could have had some influence on our friend Johannes's Skyblazer album, especially that song that we both agreed that we enjoyed so much, which was Under the Blazing Sky, how it has that kind of same kind of keyboard tone at the beginning. So just to bring in something a little bit more on the modern side, that also made me think of that as well.
Nice. It's interesting. That's the end of the first half of the album, if you will, and you really only had one blisteringly fast track as far as power metal goes. It would be the next track, Fairy Tale, which kind of brings you back into that mold. It's fast, it's upbeat, it's quite good. It has that quintessential power metal drumming pattern and a chorus which is quite good but very repetitive. And I think that here the verses and the guitar riffs are what kind of stood out to me. And it was like a toe tapper. I found myself kind of like tapping along to this one as I was listening to it. The instrumental section kind of slows everything down just a bit. And then I thought that was kind of a nice touch to bring it down a little bit. And then at least the first one. And then the second one is really just like your quintessential power metal instrumental section. A forgotten tune, a tune that nobody talks about when they talk about Edguy. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it's probably one of their most underrated songs. It's a really good tune. Being that I had Theater of Salvation first, I had the Japanese edition, and it had bonus tracks of Fairy Tale and Walk on Fighting. Incidentally, the next song, live versions of both. So I knew those two songs. They were the only two songs I knew from this album when I would eventually purchase it. I was disappointed that I was retroactively disappointed that Toby hits this high note in the studio version and he doesn't do it on the live version. And I retroactively was sad because it sounded so cool. I'm not going to try to reenact it, but
thank you.
Yeah, this is a really good, again, like you said, like going back to a bit more of a faster pace, but yeah, I also like the part where it just goes dun dun doo 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 doo. It's almost like a little taste of what would come as Edguy would get progressively goofier as the years would go on. Actually, we'll talk about "But Here I Am," which is kind of their first delve into being ridiculous, I think. But really good tune. I like this one a lot, and it was, one of the first two songs I had ever heard from this album, so I kind of holds a special place for that reason alone.
Well, talk about the second track that you heard from the album, which was Walk on Fighting. I'm curious to hear your thoughts because things jumped out to me on this track that I never realized before.
Yeah, just in a macro sense, that these two songs were the live tracks they chose to use as bonus tracks on Theater of Salvation, and like you have to question if they ever played either of these songs live again after the Vainglory Opera tour.
Good point.
But they came across really, really strong live. I thought they were recorded really well, and I enjoyed those live versions a lot. This song is like a totally different type of song after Fairy Tale. Again, it goes back to maybe even a slightly slower pace than How Many Miles, which was also kind of a mid-tempo song. But this one, I think, has more of a deliberate pace to it. But again, this is I think another really strong song. I think that it kind of, unfortunately, has the distinction of following like a really hard to keep up with pace of not pace but quality of songs. I mean, Until We Rise Again, How Many Miles, Scarlet Rose, Out of Control, Vainglory Opera, Fairy Tale, like these are all some of Edguy's greatest songs ever. And then eventually, you get to a point where like, wow, the song I still think is very good. It doesn't quite hit the mark as much as those previous songs do. Even if it's just slightly doesn't hit the mark. But it's a good example of that Edguy's not a one-trick pony that's just going to do super fast power metal, Eagle Fly Free tributes and power ballads. There's definitely some really good stuff that are in between those two extremes.
When you listen to the guitar intro and the slow drums, I actually thought this song was going to be a power ballad. Of course, I knew what it was, but it gives the impression like it's going to be a power ballad. But it's really more of just like a hard rock tune, and it's different. It's so different. And you mentioned this. It's so different than the rest of the album. In my opinion, and you're going to think I'm nuts because I actually had this in my notes prior to this past Saturday, I actually think it has an early Queensryche feel to it. It reminds me of something that you would have heard off The Warning or Rage for Order in 1986 or something like that. The chorus is simple but effective, and it's just even the guitar solo has like an 80s feel to it. So like when I think of this track, I think of like leather jackets, muscle cars, and like Hairspray. That's what I think of when I hear this song, but I don't get that sense from anything else on the album. So it really is kind of an outlier. And then we get to the back of the album with Tomorrow, and we'll get to the rest, but this is where it just kind of loses me a bit. Tomorrow has this very heavy orchestration, and an intro with like heavy orchestration, and it almost sounds like a video game soundtrack in a way. And it's the second true ballad on the album. It's just not as good, in my opinion, as Scarlet Rose. It's not a bad tune. It's just a little boring, and it starts off this back end of the album where like it was almost like they were out of ideas but wanted to make the album a little longer, so they kind of just put stuff on there which maybe been better suited for bonus tracks or something like that.
Yeah, this song never really did a whole lot for me, honestly. It's like you said, it's fine. It's a little bit. It's almost like a little bit too melodramatic, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. But it's the shortest song on the album, so it's got that going for it. It's under 4 minutes, so it's a relatively quick listen, if nothing else.
Yeah, it's fine. I would have been okay with this being a bonus track, I guess. But I mean, also, you don't want to just start cutting songs off the album because next thing you know, you have an EP on your hands. Because it's not a terribly long album to begin with. It clocks in around 50 minutes. But it's fine. I mean, when you have this and Scarlet Rose and him, it's like maybe you could have left this one out, I guess.
That's kind of how I looked at it.
Yeah.
It's my least favorite song on the album.
Yeah, it's probably one of mine as well. And again, like it really kind of almost, I wouldn't say kills the momentum, but it definitely slows down the momentum because the first 8 tracks are just like at the very worst, very, very good. So,
well, yeah, I agree with that. And ironically, they kind of piggyback Tomorrow with a song called No More Foolin'. And this is a quintessential example of when power metal bands try too hard to just do a straight up metal song. When Gamma Ray does it, it sucks. When Edguy does it, it sucks. And
you know what it is, Justin? It's when power metal bands try to be Judas Priest.
Exactly. You are 100% right. But every time they do it, it's not good. And
leave it to Judas Priest. Judas Priest was doing it just fine.
I literally almost picked the Judas Priest album this week. Fast forward, I didn't, but I almost picked the Judas Priest album just to wipe my taste away from this. I literally had Painkiller in the queue, but I decided to put that on hold for a bit. But yeah, this is just a straight up heavy metal tune. It's fast, it's heavy, it's just not very good. And if I wanted to hear this, I would just put on, a Judas Priest album. It's just something is missing here, and the chorus sucks. And not a fan of this tune.
Yeah, and I never was, and I'm still not. It reminds me also of Avantasia has a song called "The Final Sacrifice," which was a B-side from Metal Opera Part 1 that ended up being repurposed and actually used as a main track on Part 2. It has Virgin Steel's David DeFice on vocals, who is awesome. Like, I love that looking back on it, that he was a part of those early Avantasia albums because he has such a totally unique voice that it was cool to hear it. I would love to see him go like join Avantasia on tour and just be like that outlier vocalist or whatever. But that was in a song also that I just didn't think was very good. It was like Tobias was trying too hard to do something that was really heavy, and it just kind of fell flat. And I feel the same way about this song, and it's kind of a bummer because it's the last like really heavy song on the album, and it's to me easily the worst of the heavy songs. It might even be my least favorite song on the album altogether.
I think that's fair. I think that the Avantasia song you mentioned, that it would actually like blows this song away. That's how much I don't care for this particular track. But yeah, it's just a miss for me. And then they get to Him, which I don't know that I ever realized was an Ultravox cover. Like, I just don't think I ever knew that, but it is. And it's really just a third ballad on an album that has 10 proper tracks, right? Because you have Overture at the beginning and then Him at the end. It's basically 10 tracks and 3 ballads, which is normally not the percentage of ballads that you'd otherwise think. What are your thoughts on this? Because I have a couple, but I want to hear what you have to say.
It's definitely better than the last 2 tracks. I'll give it that, but it probably is still my third least favorite. I mean, like, my 3 least favorite songs on the album are the last 3 songs, which I think is why the album kind of takes a dive for me towards the end for that very reason. I'm fascinated by metal bands' obsession with Ultravox. I mean, it's second only to ABBA when it comes to like synthy new wave bands that metal bands like to cover. It's cool. I feel like I didn't appreciate this song as much as I do now when I was younger. It's just odd to finish off an album with a cover to me. But it's pretty good. It's a pretty good song, and it's definitely the best of the last 3, but it's just disappointing that the album finishes off with these 3 tracks when the first 8 tracks, I mean, mind you, one of them was a 1.5-minute intro starring Mike Crea. It was such a strong start, and then it's just kind of this, mediocre kind of end on these last 3 tunes. But
I actually like this. I gotta be honest. Like, I think the guitar solo is fantastic. It's uber melodic. I again, not knowing that it was a cover, this was news to me, but like, I really like this track, and they give this nod to Power and Glory, and who doesn't like Hercules and Paul Roma? I mean, to me, this is just a really fun way to end the album. And then I have a confession to make. I've listened to this album for 25 years. I don't know that I've ever heard But Here I Am, the bonus track that you mentioned earlier. I don't think I've ever heard it. So I'm going to have to kind of give you the floor. What is this, and what have I been missing?
Yeah, this song has a very funny nostalgia thing for me, because I remember I was, obsessed with bonus tracks, and I was always like, trying to find stuff that I knew existed but I didn't have in my possession. And it all started with Halloween's massive catalog of B-sides and bonus tracks that I found somebody online who sold a burned disc of Halloween B-sides and bonus tracks that I was blown away that this band that I loved had so many songs that were just not on, the full-length album. So when I had realized that Edguy had a bonus track from Vainglory Opera, I had to seek it out. And what I found was, I probably on Napster was a 96 megabits per second recording, which if you know anything about MP3s, it's not the best sound. I personally consider 128 to be like the bare minimum of listenable
I would agree with
MP3. And so this was, I'll never forget, it was 96, so it sounded pretty assy, to be fair. I think I later on found a better version of it, but I played this song for Knops when I was in college, and he absolutely loved this song. Just because of like how goofy it was. I think it actually made it onto an audio power hour at one point in time, if you could imagine, of all the metal songs in the world. It has that, what would kind of become the, like, tried and true Edguy random speaking during the song, which they would go on to master with Lavatory Love Machine. But I mean, to me, like, this was just Edguy kind of dipping their toe in the water of just writing a really ridiculous, goofy, comical kind of song and releasing it. Just it happens to be a bonus track, but I think that it kind of ends the album in a little bit less of a down feel. Because like I said, like the last 3 tracks, I mean, I agree with you that Him is a cool cover and it's a pretty good song, but it just doesn't compare to me to those first 8 tracks. And so this is kind of a fun way to put a bow on a pretty solid and a pretty iconic album.
Yeah, well, I got to be honest. Now I've got my homework, so as soon as we're done, I'm going to listen to a brand new Edguy track for the first time in 25 years. But I'm curious of 2 things. Number one, obviously, I'm going to ask you what your score is, scale of 1 to 10. But 2, I want to ask you what you think your score would have been before the week started, because this is one of the few times where I think my score might have gone down just a touch, not a lot, but just a touch, because of some of the tracks that didn't resonate with me.
Yeah, I would say just a touch for me as well. I would still give it. I'm going to give it one of my wishy-washy scores. I'm going to give it an 8.625. Right in between an 8.5 and an 8.75. I think that, like, had you asked me before I listened to it, I think I might have said it was closer to a 9. We both gave Theater of Salvation a 9 just for
comparison's sake.
Yeah, and I do think that this album on a whole is a shade not as good as Theater of Salvation. That being said, though, the first 8 tracks are pretty much as good as it gets for me when it comes to Edguy and power metal in general. So I think that really holds the score up in my opinion, despite a weaker kind of end point. How about you? Where are you landing on this?
I think I would have said it was an 8.5 if I hadn't listened to it this week. But having digested it again and again, it's an 8 for me. Definitely not as good as Theater. I do think that that's the superior album. I thought that going into the week. That hasn't changed. But there is a lot to enjoy here. And I know I was hard on it, but it's still an 8 for me. It's just that I can't get it into that rarefied air because there's just a little bit too much dead weight that they have to carry. But it's still a very enjoyable listen. And amongst, for my money, probably a top 3 Edguy album in the discography.
Yeah, hard to argue. I'm sure at some point we'll talk about some of the other albums in full. Particularly, I would like to talk about Hellfire Club, which I think that some people consider Edguy's best album. I think it's definitely in contention. I'll say some of my all-time favorite Edguy songs appear on Mandrake, including what I consider to be maybe the most underrated Edguy song of all time, Jerusalem. But all in due time. This was only our second Edguy episode, so I'm sure we'll be returning to talk about them again. But we talked about at least my first 2 Edguy albums and probably yours as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I look forward to talking about more of their stuff because since they are not active, I just find myself not listening to them as much as some other bands that, are still around and kicking. So it's interesting to me, but it's actually a perfect segue in many regards because there was a band that was completely dormant for many years that has announced a reunion after a long time apart, and that's Elegy. A band that we have not talked about on the podcast, but Elegy has announced their reunion. They're coming out with, they're re-releasing all their old material. They're going back out on tour, from what I understand. I would probably be very happy if this band played Prog Power. I'm not going to lie. I am a huge fan of Ian Parry's vocals, and I just love the guitar work on some of this stuff. And after a long time away, Elegy is back in 2023. I never thought I would say those words. So we go from Edguy to Elegy, but here's hoping.
I did not know that, and that is awesome. That is really cool. Yeah, their last album came out 21 years ago, so yeah, it kind of feels like Conception getting back together. Just a band that hasn't made an album in 20 plus years. That's exciting. And is it the original lineup or the classic lineup? Do we know? Or?
Well, it's got Ian Parry on vocals, who was not their original singer. Edward Havinga was their original singer, but he's very good. And quite frankly, we should probably do 2 Elegy albums at some point, one with each of the singers, because they are markedly different. But they're a band that kind of like, they're a prog band, but they also kind of touch other things as well. There's a touch of power metal and a touch of thrash in certain spots. I just think they're a very interesting band, and I never thought that they would get back together. I had heard that there was all sorts of things going on in their camp. So when I saw this, I nearly fell out of my chair. I really hope that they get over here or play 70,000 Tons or something, because it is a long time coming. I would be very happy to see them.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I only own one album from
Which one?
Elegy, Supremacy.
Oh, okay. So you know the original singer, but there's a lot of meat on the bone that you need to check out with these guys, and I will probably pick an album then, because now that they're back together, and you got some homework to do, so I look forward to it.
Maybe we should do a career retrospective like we did with Conception.
Well, you better have some time, because they have quite a few albums, but I'd love to do it. I don't know all of their material as well as I should, although I know quite a bit of it. So.
Yeah. Also, I just found out that Ed Warby used to be their drummer. So there you go.
Now you know where he's from. And finally, some interesting news. Nightwish has announced that they are basically going out to do Human Nature, or I should say the follow-up to Human Nature. They're coming out with a new album next year. It's going to have 12 songs. They're not going to tour for it, though, which I found interesting, because I thought that's where they made a lot of their money, but they, for reasons undisclosed, they will not be touring for their next album. So when Nightwish does hit the road again, I'm sure it'll be very exciting to see, because it'll be a long time coming.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people made more of this than it is, because they've done this before, where they've taken a touring hiatus, which I think is probably a healthy thing to do when you're a band that plays as often as Nightwish does and travels the world as extensively. So cool. I'm very curious what the next album is going to sound like, because that Human Nature was so just generally panned by so many people. It's funny, because like the highest compliment I've heard that album get was I didn't hate it.
Ooh,
and I think I was the one who said it. So, I think it was overpanned. I don't think it was as bad as people made it out to be, but also I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it wasn't disappointing, because it was. So I'm very, very curious to see what direction they go in after that. I don't know how much of the negative publicity affects what they do at all, or if they even heard any of it. Because if you're smart and you're famous, you stay the hell off of social media. But meanwhile, we come to find out that former members Tarja and Marco will be doing at least one show together, which is kind of mind-boggling to me, because I thought that Marco had a lot to do with Tarja being asked to leave the band in the first place. We spoke earlier. They only overlapped each other for 2 albums, Century Child and Once. You got to figure they'll do a cover of Phantom of the Opera. I don't know how Flora and Hank Port are going to feel about that. But I mean, the original Nightwish Phantom of the Opera was Tarja and Marco. So I'm very curious. Speaking of curiosities, very curious as to what they play. I'd love to see it. I mean, I missed Tarja's solo set when she played at Prague Power. So to this day, I have not seen her perform live, which I think is a hole that needs to be filled at some point in my fandom. Because despite what some might say, I think that she is a legend, and all legends should be seen by fans of the genre. So,
There you go.
but yeah, I think that's such a fascinating thing that the two of them. I made a joke that they're gonna call themselves Nightwish of Fire.
Very, very interesting stuff. Nightwish goes on a little bit of a hiatus, and then all the former members get back together and go out on tour. So go figure. But that brings us to next week, and it is my turn to choose. And I went back and forth on about 2 or 3 different albums. I mentioned Judas Priest earlier. I nearly picked a Motley Crue album, but I've decided to go with something completely different. That a band that we have probably touched upon, but I don't know that we've ever talked about in depth, definitely not on the podcast, and probably not offline either. And that is, the band is Winter Sun, and the album is called Time One. It came out in 2012. I have to think that you're familiar with the album at least a little bit, but we've never talked about Winter Sun, and they are one of the most polarizing bands on the planet, so I thought it would make for some interesting discussion. This album has 5 tracks. The intro track is about 4 minutes of kind of like, music and orchestration, and another one of the tracks is kind of an instrumental track as well. So it really has like 3 long tracks on this thing. It is a very interesting listen, but I want to hear your thoughts on it, so that's why I chose it.
I have listened to it, but it's been a very, very, very long time, and actually that really sets up a perfect segue, because we're really hoping to put a sauna in our Metal Exchange Studios, so get onto that Patreon and sign up, because I'm not gonna let what's his name from Winter Sun, is it Yanni or Yari?
Yeah, Yari.
I'm not gonna let Yari be the only guy who gets a sauna paid for by the fans. We have goals too.
Polarizing, like I said, a very polarizing band.
And then when Time 2 comes out in 2029, estimated, we'll be recording it from our sauna paid for by the Patreon.
So thank you. We appreciate everyone who did sign up. We ask everyone else to consider it. At the very least, if you like what you're hearing, please give us a like and a follow. It helps other people find the podcast. And next week, we'll come back with some Winter Sun. And I promise you, our recap of Time 1 will come out long before Time 2. Guaranteed. So that being said, enjoy your week, my friend, and I will talk to you soon.
You as well. Looking forward to it. Winter Sun, Time 1 next week. Very cool.